This presentation is for Western Civilization 2 with Professor Esposito. In this presentation, we will discuss the historical context of the Rape of Nanjing. This presentation was created by Catherine Atkinson, Mark Brown, and Samantha Burgess. The Rape of Nanjing was a 6-week period of mass murder, rape, torture, and looting that began in December 1937. These crimes were carried out by the Japanese army against the soldiers and civilians of the city of Nanjing, China. The event has been described as one of the most violent attacks in the 20th century. Soldiers and civilians were murdered en masse. Women and children were brutally raped and murdered. The city's infrastructure was destroyed by looting and arson. In this presentation, we will examine how this came to happen, the atrocities that occurred, and the outcomes of this horrific event. The factors that led up to the Rape of Nanjing were complex. The context for the massacre was the Second Sino-Japanese War, but tensions had been high between Japan and China since the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894. Over the decades before the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese had gained strong influence in the Chinese region of Manchuria. This desire for imperial influence over Manchuria was one of the key factors of the Russo-Japanese War. Tensions between China and Japan had been particularly high since Japan's formal invasion and establishment of a puppet state in Manchuria in 1931. As these tensions grew, so did Japan's military force. China, however, was already suffering from its civil war between the communists and nationalists. This conflict had weakened China's military stability. These high tensions between China and Japan caused occasional military skirmishes to break out and then die down between 1931 and 1937. But in July 1937, one of these skirmishes, the Marco Polo Bridge incident, only escalated the tensions, resulting in full-blown war. In November 1937, Japanese troops took Shanghai and set their sights on Nanjing, the capital of nationalist China. Japanese troops reached Nanjing in December. On their march from Shanghai to Nanjing, Japanese soldiers committed many atrocities against the Chinese. Now we will discuss some of the important people who played large roles in the defense of and attack on Nanjing. Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of the Republic of China during the Nanjing genocide. He gave orders for the capital to be moved from Nanjing to Chongqing as the Japanese troops marched to Nanjing from Shanghai. Emperor Hirohito was the Emperor of Japan from 1926 to 1989 and oversaw much of Japan's imperial expansion and militarization in the first half of the 20th century. Emperor Hirohito signed off on the Japanese Army's proposition to not adhere to the constraints of international law regarding Chinese prisoners. Prince Yasuhiko Asaka was a militarist Japanese general. He was an uncle-in-law of Emperor Hirohito. He was assigned to Nanjing in early December 1937 and reportedly gave the order to kill all captives, even though he knew of the Chinese army's willingness to negotiate a surrender. General Chang was a Chinese military commander in charge of troops in Nanjing. Many Chinese troops who battled around Nanjing as the Japanese approached fled to Nanjing for refuge. Tang faced disobedience from many soldiers in the city and struggled to maintain order or carry out the defense plans for the city. General Tang ordered a general retreat from the city of Nanjing on December 12th. General Iwane Matsui was appointed commander of the Central China Area Army in November 1937 until Prince Asaka took command from him in early December. He issued the command to take Nanjing by force on December 10th. He issued orders that property of citizens and third-party nations not be attacked, but these orders were disobeyed. John Rabe was a German businessman living in Nanjing during the massacre. He was elected leader of the International Committee of the Nanjing Safety Zone, likely due to his own status in the Nazi Party. He worked to move Chinese troops out of the Nanjing Safety Zone so that it would not be a target for attack by the Japanese army. It is estimated that some 300,000 Chinese civilians took refuge in the safety zone during the Rape of Nanjing. He also kept diaries documenting many of the atrocities of the massacre. The Second Sino-Japanese War began on July 7, 1937, though some sources cite the war beginning in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. On August 5th, Japanese Emperor Hirohito ratified the Japanese Army's proposition to remove the constraints of international law in regard to treatment of Chinese prisoners. This included combatant and non-combatant prisoners. Between August and November, the Japanese and Chinese fought tirelessly over control of Shanghai. By mid-November, Shanghai fell, and the Japanese began to move towards the capital of nationalist China, Nanjing. Also in November, a group of Westerners living in Nanjing established the International Committee of Safety and declared a safety zone in one area of Nanjing. This area, about the size of Central Park in New York City, housed many refugee camps and was intended to be a safe haven for Westerners and Chinese civilians alike from the fighting. On December 1st, as the Japanese army got closer to Nanjing, the mayor of Nanjing ordered civilians to move to the safety zone. Also on this day, the national Chinese government abandoned the city. The Japanese army arrived outside Nanjing in early December 1937. On the 9th, they demanded surrender of the city within 24 hours. On December 10th, with no surrender from the Chinese, the Japanese laid siege to Nanjing. This included bombardments from the ground and air. On the 13th, Nanjing fell to the Japanese, and the 6-week period of unfathomable violence began, ending in late January 1938. The atrocities committed during the massacre at Nanjing are inconceivable. There are no exact records, but it is estimated that between 40,000 and over 300,000 civilians and soldiers alike were massacred. Women were raped by the tens of thousands. The city was destroyed by looting and arson. Civilians were brutally massacred during the 6 weeks following the fall of Nanjing to the Japanese. Corpses lined the streets. These were non-combatant civilians murdered en masse. Infants, children, adults, and the elderly met their deaths at the hands of Japanese soldiers. John Rabe's diary described the horrific events. On December 13th, he wrote, "We come across corpses every 100 to 200 yards. The bodies of civilians that I examined had bullet holes in their backs. These people had presumably been fleeing and were shot from behind." The mass rape that took place during the massacre was unfathomable. It is estimated that between 20,000 to 80,000 women and children were brutally raped by Japanese soldiers. Many were violently murdered after being raped. Pregnant women and the elderly were not spared. Many women were victims of gang rape. Princess Saka's orders to kill all captives were carried out. As Emperor Hirohito had signed off on the Japanese army's proposition to disregard international law in treatment of Chinese prisoners, the Japanese soldiers killed Chinese soldiers en masse, including those who surrendered. On December 16th, John Rabe wrote, "I've just heard that hundreds more disarmed Chinese soldiers have been led out of our zone to be shot, including 50 of our police, who are to be executed for letting soldiers in. The road to Shaguan is nothing but a field of corpses strewn with the remains of military equipment." End quote. In one instance, Japanese troops gathered 1,300 Chinese soldiers and civilians at the Taiping Gate and murdered them by blowing them up with landmines, then dousing them with gasoline and setting them alight. Those who survived were murdered by bayonet. In some cases, prisoners were buried alive. The Japanese soldiers also engaged in mass looting and arson of the city. 1/3 of the city was destroyed due to arson. In some instances, soldiers murdered shopkeepers, stole their goods, then locked people inside the stores and set them on fire. John Rabe wrote on December 13th, "The Japanese march through the city in groups of 10 to 20 soldiers and loot the shops. If I had not seen it with my own eyes, I would not have believed it. They smash open windows and doors and take whatever they like, allegedly because they're short of rations. I watched with my own eyes as they looted the cafe of our German baker Herr Kiesling. Hempel's hotel was broken into as well, as was almost every shop on Chungsheng and Taiping Road. Some Japanese soldiers dragged their booty away in crates. Others requisitioned rickshaws to transport their stolen goods to safety." The death toll of the rape of Nanjing is estimated to be between 40,000 and 300,000 people. Many who survived had been injured and raped during the atrocities. After the Japanese surrendered at the end of World War II, the primary officers commanding Japanese troops at Nanjing were put on trial for war crimes by the International Military Tribunal of the Far East. General Matsui was tried and hanged for his role in the rape of Nanjing in 1948. Chiang Kai-shek established the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal in 1946. Only one officer implicated in the rape of Nanjing, named Hisao Tani, was prosecuted, and he was executed by firing squad in 1947. There has been debate about the existence of a massacre by some Japanese officials. General Matsui and Princess Saka both denied any massacre taking place. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, waves of revisionist history coursed through Japanese society that rewrote the history of Nanjing. Many Japanese citizens, including soldiers who had taken part in Nanjing, spoke of the truth of the massacre that did indeed occur. The rape of Nanjing still affects Sino-Japanese relations today. In the 2000s, the number murdered in the event has been a contentious issue. Japanese textbooks vary on the number of casualties, much to the chagrin of China. Japanese historians maintain that the highest estimate of those killed is 200,000 people, while Chinese historians state that more than 300,000 people lost their lives in Nanjing. The rape of Nanjing was a formative element in constructing the Chinese national identity and is still seen as a national unifying event today. Now we will answer some important questions. Was there a Chinese resistance movement in the city during the Japanese occupation? Even though the Chinese government ordered an evacuation of the capital, some businessmen, missionaries, doctors, and other professionals remained to continue their practices. Some citizens decided to stay because they wanted to resist and fight for their homes. Others simply could not leave because they did not have the means to emigrate. The International Committee of the Nanjing Safety Zone provided refuge for many citizens of Nanjing, but not all could be protected from the atrocities. Were the Japanese ever held accountable for their actions in Nanjing? There were many investigations opened to hold Japanese soldiers accountable for their crimes. The United Nations organized the Investigation of War Crimes Committee in the Far East and Pacific regions. Also, the Tokyo War Crimes Trial lasted nearly 3 years, the longest war crimes trial in history. What role, if any, did Japanese culture play in provoking the genocide? Japanese culture was taken over by militarism in the 20th century. The militaristic ideals that coursed through Japanese society certainly played a role in the genocide at Nanjing. In conclusion, the rape of Nanjing impacted and ended the lives of many. This violence carried out by the Japanese caused emotional, physical, political, economic, and infrastructural damages. The lives of many were lost, families disrupted, abuse and cruelty were rampant during this period. These factors caused trauma and many problems for the inhabitants of Nanjing. This event has left a deep scar on Chinese civilians and the hearts of many. The rape of Nanjing demonstrates how much of an effect imperialism can have over nations and the effort people go through to follow imperialism's goals.